Central Monday morning rail. 15 cars and 15 restless riders, 3 conductors, 25 sacks of mail. All along the southbound Odyssey, the train pulls out at Kankakee and rolls along past houses, farms, and fields, passing trains that have no name, and freight yards full of old black men, and the graveyards of the rusted automobiles. Good morning, America, how are you? Said, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done.
I can't believe they want to kill Amtrak.
Start it up, shut it down, slow it down, keep it open, get rid of long-distance trains, bring in competitors, and by the way, don't adequately fund capital investment or infrastructure, and also run it as a business. I mean, what a terrible way to run a railroad. What on earth are we thinking about?
From the San Francisco Chronicle. Amtrak says that it cannot continue to operate at the current funding level of $1.2 billion. Assuming some variation of this reform package goes ahead, what would be an acceptable funding level to the administration?
Well, the funding level is something that I'm not, basically what I want to see first is the legislative reform. What I have said is that the President and I would request the additional funds once the legislative reform is in place.
I had a great deal of frustration in my several years of service on the Amtrak Reform Council. There were clearly some people there who just hated Amtrak, and I don't necessarily even mean hated rail passenger service. They hated Amtrak, the entity. And, you know, there's a lot to dislike about the way Amtrak's been operated over the past several decades, probably more to be pitied than disliked. But there were certainly some people there who my fellow members of the board, who were out to get rid of Amtrak, if you will. So rather than point at where the funding should come from, which we never resolved, if you look at the Amtrak Reform Council's final report, you really do not see a clear recommendation as to how the funding should come to Amtrak and come to the railroads in order to build a better infrastructure to allow for expanded passenger train service in this country.
You, Mr. Rosen, and the administration wants to shut down long-distance trains. I understand if you just, but why don't you just say it rather than use words that seem to mean something else?
Right now, the intercity passenger rail network is funded from general revenues only. Highways and airlines get a federal match. The highway budget is over $38 billion for fiscal 2007. And yet people are complaining that Amtrak has lost over $30 billion since its inception in 1971. The fact is that there hasn't been the kind of incremental improvements in Amtrak to make it a modern intercity passenger rail system. And that's because there is not a federal funding structure set up to have it be a system that is funded for mobility. Instead, the argument has drifted into profit and loss. Amtrak loses money because it has not been given enough money to cover the cost of its fares. But in fact, the problem is that the revenues that it does have, any transportation mode has, are not always covered by fare box recovery.
Every other form of transportation in this country has been heavily subsidized and invested in by the federal government, usually with federal state matching funds of 80-20, 90-10, and railroads in this country have, for almost all of their existence, been simply part of private enterprise. They need to have access to private capital markets for investment. There's a limit to how much they can invest. There's a limit to how much they can borrow. You know what the Amtrak national system costs? I testified in front of Congress when we did our final report. The Amtrak national system costs somewhere between $350 million a year and something south of $500 million a year. The rest of the Amtrak money that comes from Congress every year is to invest in capital. 90% of those dollars go to the Northeast Corridor, where Amtrak owns its own infrastructure and has to deal with 100-year-old bridges and 150-year-old tunnels and all kinds of things that make it real difficult to run trains at 150 miles an hour and to carry 2 and 3 trains an hour between the major cities.
The poster child or boy for this type of organization is Britain. Now, where they set up private, they broke their railroads, they destroyed vertical integration, and they set up a separate infrastructure company, separate rolling stock company, and separate operating companies. And they actually had a lot of private companies that have shown up to do it, because the amount of subsidy has just skyrocketed. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made if you continue to subsidize it.
There was a 6-year funding plan in place for Amtrak for the first time ever, and the Bush administration managed to fight that down. Amtrak is really in a state of limbo right now, more so than it ever has been in the past. There's questions about the legitimacy of the board. There's questions about the leadership at this point. There's questions about, once again, Amtrak being a political football.
The government chooses where we're going to make the investment. And so Amtrak is so easy to point at because it's a line item on the Department of Transportation's budget every year. And you can say, well, Amtrak loses 1.2 or 1.5 or $2 billion a year or whatever it is. We never look at how much the Highway Trust Fund invests in even trying to keep the existing highways we have operating in good repair. We never look at how much we spend to keep little airports around the country in business, even though there is no real business there for them, because the airlines have long since realized you can't make money flying out of small airports and flying small planes.
All modes of transportation should be funded equally by the federal government. It was not a fair practice to only subsidize